Hi there, it's Dr. Gianna Reams, and we're going to return now to talking about the court, and specifically about conspiracies at the court, as conspiracies are always fun, but conspiracies are also useful because they tell us a little bit about how that court works. There's an ulterior motive, if you will, in me turning to conspiracies besides the fact that they're interesting. I do want to say, just a reminder, that if you enjoy these sorts of videos, please like and even subscribe to the channel. Then you get notifications when a new one drops. As mine are kind of irregular, a lot depends on when I have time to make these and other demands, as of course I teach full time at the University of Nebraska. So I make these whenever I get a chance. But I enjoy talking about the court, so we're going to dive into those. And I'm going to try to, I think, pace these across three videos, kind of like I did with the murder of Philip, because it's complex. And in the notes, in the show notes, I will list names because there are a lot of names. And I apologize in advance because not only are they a lot of unfamiliar names, which I'm quite sure that any captioning will absolutely butcher, which is why I will always put them in show notes. But they also tend to repeat. So we have a lot of Alexanders. We have a lot of Amentises. And that can get really, really confusing. I want to acknowledge that going forward. And to the best of my ability, I will try to help you, the viewer, keep these guys straight. Because even for those of us who work in this, it can be a bit like keeping a Rolodex in your head of, okay, who's that guy? And there's another issue going on that some characters are particularly well known, in part because maybe they played a role in the successor wars that followed. But that doesn't mean that folks who get named only once or twice are unimportant or nobodies. And I think that's a common mistake that folks make. So we get mention, for instance, of triarchs funding the building of ships on the Indus later. These are not insignificant people. They have a boatload of money to be able to build a boat, but we might not otherwise hear about them at all. Okay, so keep in mind that the Macedonian court was quite busy. Jean Borza has estimated that there were as many as 100 hetairoi at any time, and that then exploded under Alexander with even more. And there were, the hetairoi and their sons, which may not have been hetairoi. They may have been hetairoi in waiting, if you will. We just don't really know. But there's a lot of other folks who are officers and such at the court of Alexander. So we're dealing with a cast of thousands. And that can be really, really confusing. And when I was writing the novel, sometimes I made deliberate choices of who to include and who to exclude, partly based occasionally on what letter their name began with, and whether or not this person might appear later as a significant figure. So I'm not going to invent a whole bunch of people here and then throw a whole bunch of different people at you later. So that's sort of the struggle that the novelist deals with. But speaking as a historian trying to do, public history, I'm well aware of the fact that these names can be a bit much. All right, so the very first conspiracy, and the first and the second owe to each other, or maybe a little bit. Okay. And so we're going to start with the conspiracy that popped up, and it's maybe the least known of the three, about 2.5 years maybe after Alexander, or maybe 3 years actually, after Alexander came to the throne. Okay. And it is in many ways a holdover of the conspiracy, if you will, around the murder of Philip. And so if you haven't already listened to my 3 videos on Philip's murder, it's part 1, 2, and 3, before you listen to this one, you might want to go and listen to those, because at least a couple names are going to come up again. Okay, so with a quick review of the death of Philip, we know the guy who actually stabbed him, his name was Pausanias. We don't know if there was anybody else involved, and there's been loads of speculation. And I go over in those videos which ones I think are more likely, which ones I think are less. But there's one name I want to remind folks of that I mentioned there that I say, in my opinion, is a vastly underrated potential conspirator. And that's Alexander's cousin, Amyntas Perdica. He was a couple years older than Alexander. He was maybe a year old, maybe two, when when his father died in Illyria and Philip came to the throne. And he was no threat to Philip, so Philip kept him around. He needed an heir and a spare, and Amyntas started out as the heir until Philip got a viable heir in Alexander, and then Amyntas kind of became the spare. Argead was not. Argead, we know, had something wrong with him to the effect that he was really not a candidate until literally there was nobody else. Okay, so Alexander's real rival was never his brother Argead. It was always his cousin Amyntas, and he wastes very little time in getting rid of Amyntas after Philip's death. But Amyntas is not initially implicated in the murder of Philip. Instead, we get mention of these three brothers from Lynkestis. And a quick reminder, Lynkestis is saddles the very northwestern edge of modern Greece into, what would be Albania, and parts of northern Macedonia. Modern borders don't match ancient borders. And Lynkestis was originally its own kingdom. Okay, Philip is the one that essentially fused Upper Macedonia and Lower Macedonia. Okay, and he brought in two kingdoms that had been independent and at various points were arguably stronger than Macedonia were, depending on what point in history we're looking at. Lynkestis is one of those. The other was Elamet. And there's a few others like Orestes and such. But Lynkestis is the one we want to look at. So that's that northwestern kingdom. And up until Philip, it was independent. Now, over time, and in fact, it tangled with Macedon, not infrequently. During the Peloponnesian War, Perdiccas II employed Spartan aid to try to bring the Lynkestians to heel. So there's a long time of antagonism between these two kingdoms, and also of intermarriage. Okay, so Philip's mother, Eurydice, came from Lynkestis, and as has been mentioned, she may also very well have been part Illyrian. And so there's also intermarriage between the Illyrian royal houses and Lynkestis. So this is kind of the background of what's going on. And the brothers were all implicated, along with this Pausanias, who's from Orestes, which is right next door. It's just south of Lynkestis. And they are accused of having a hand in the plot. Alexander also produced a letter from Darius, supposedly, that implicated Darius and essentially paying them off to do this. I'm not sure any of that's necessarily wrong. And that's because, while I think Pausanias had a very valid grievance on his own, and again, go watch the other videos, the Lynkestians may have too, because Philip had earlier exiled their father, Iropus. Now, we are assuming this is the royal house. There is actually nowhere in the ancient record that says that. Okay, but given names, given other things, given their obvious prominence, it's a pretty safe bet that this is the royal house. Okay, so but I did want to be honest and say that no ancient text actually says so. So anyway, looking down, going back to this, that they had humiliated Iropus and driven him out down to Athens, I think it was, and his son Alexander, another Alexander, okay, was now effectively in control of Lynkestis. So as soon as Philip was killed, that same Alexander, so Alexander Lynkestis, Alexander L, as opposed to Alexander or ATG. I'll try to use those to maybe keep these two guys separate in your head. So ATG is Alexander the Great. Alexander L is Alexander of Lynkestis, okay? And Alexander L immediately grabbed a shield and put on his cuirass and came over and stood next to Alexander, ATG, and basically, banged his spear on his shield, and I'll fight for you. He's acknowledging Alexander, ATG, as king. That saves his life, okay? That and the fact that he is married to Antipatros' daughter. We're not sure which one, not Phila, probably. And so he had Antipatros in his corner, but it's apparently really more his importance and also his army, his phalanx, that Alexander is not going to mess with him. But there must have been enough of something that Alexander did accuse and execute Alexander L's two younger brothers, Hieronymus and Argead. Okay, not to be confused with Argead. Okay, sorry. Again, we're back to these very, very similar names. So Argead is a different person. So Hieronymus and Argead are killed essentially on Philip's grave, okay, as almost an offering to Philip. But Alexander L gets to live. And again, he can kind of thank Antipatros for that, but I think Beth Carney is right in saying that he had his own prominence, that maybe he's married to Antipatros' daughter because he's that important, okay? So I think she's right in that respect. And that's why Alexander spares him. And again, he needs the support of the Lynkestians. Now, the other thing I want to say about all of this is that somehow the Lynkestian royal family is related to the Argeads. Probably, almost surely, through the female line, which means it's a weak link, but they are Argeads somehow. And just a reminder, only Argeads can take the throne. The preference is very much through the male line, okay? But later, one of Cassandros's claims for his sons is, oh, hey, their mama's Thessaloniki, okay, the daughter of Philip. So even the female line has prestige, all right? So he is an Argead. That means he has a distant claim on the throne, okay? But if you've got Alexander there, or Amyntas initially, then they're going to trump any claim that the Lynkestians had. So the Lynkestians, if they were involved in Philip's death, and if there was some kind of mini conspiracy, and if well, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but if you read the second novel, you'll see there's a little bit of thinking in that direction, maybe. I would not be surprised if there is a little more to it than just Pausanias' grievance. And certainly, again, the Upper Macedonian kingdom hadn't been under Lower Macedon for that long. And I keep hammering on this because I think it gets forgotten. By the time Alexander's dead and people are looking back on Philip, it's almost like Philip could do no wrong, and Philip was this great Macedonian king, and everybody loved Philip, and that's later beatification. Okay, during Philip's lifetime, there was very clear that there was some opposition, okay, to this, and certainly Iropus is part of that opposition. So what are they wanting? Quite possibly to support Amyntas. Okay. And that maybe Amyntas had promised them things that maybe more independence, for one thing. That would be reason enough to oppose Philip. And so it's quite possible that this all formed some kind of little conspiracy. But at least after Philip was dead, we do have a hint in Plutarch that Alexander was, that there was clearly dispute about who's going to inherit. And keep in mind, Alexander's 20 years old, and his cousin Amyntas is older than him, and also would have had military experience, and also is an Argead, and also is the son of a former king. Okay, his dad was king before Philip. So this is not a weird. It's a very traditional sort of Macedonian conflict over inheritance. And Plutarch has this line in the life of Alexander that he says, all Macedonia was festering with revolt looking to Amyntas, Perdica, and the sons of Iropus. Okay. That's very interesting. Okay. Especially the sons of Iropus suggests maybe Hieronymus and Argead weren't killed immediately. Okay. So, but Alexander didn't waste much time. So this is suggestive that there really is some real tension between the two cousins as to who's going to take the throne. Alexander needed support, and he got it from Antipatros, which is interesting because there's Alexander L, okay, connected to Antipatros. So maybe Alexander L is playing two sides against the middle. I'm just throwing out things to kind of say this is messy. Okay, and I'm sorry, it is messy. You almost need a flow chart to figure out what's going on. But we are told that Amyntas Perdica is eventually arrested by Alexander and put to death. Okay, we don't know how soon after the death of Philip this was. I expect sooner rather than later. My guess is probably within 6 months, if maybe much less than that. But at that time, there were two other people who were involved who fled. One of these was an Amyntas, son of Antiochus, not the later Antiochus, okay. And then Aristomenes of Pherae. Both of them had supported Amyntas Perdica. Okay, and I just want to say Pherae had old ties to the Macedonian royal house. So it's interesting they're supporting the other cousin. And later we're told that this Amyntas, son of Antiochus, took a letter to Darius, the king of Persia. Okay, Arrian tells us this, not Plutarch. Takes a letter to Darius from Alexander L. Interesting, right? Okay. So that's a setup. Okay. Temporarily, everything gets tapped down. Alexander's also dealing with Attilus's family at the same time. Although I think I've said somewhere in something that I think Tim Howe might be onto something that Alexander planned to marry his father's widow, and then that's would have been impetus enough for Olympias, I think, to get rid of her. And then at that point, Alexander didn't have a choice; he almost had to kill Attalus, and Parmenion sided with him. And then Parmenion's sons get plum assignments. Okay. The two most important assignments almost in the army after Parmenions. Okay. So all of this, welcome to Macedonian politics. This is how the court works. Okay, who you know, who you're married to, who you can get on your side, who's going to kill somebody for you, and Parmenion lets Attalus be killed. And so now Alexander has Antipatros in his corner and Parmenion in his corner. And I want to say something else too, just a reminder. I've mentioned it elsewhere, but it figures in here. Antipatros and Parmenion did not like each other. Okay. They were enemies. Okay. But they could, and I think sometimes did work together, but they're not necessarily buddies. So we got all this stuff going on. All right. So Alexander is acquitted or passed over, or the implication from the literature is that people believed he was somehow guilty. But he gets spared because of his ties. Or maybe he really was friends with Alexander and changed his spots partially. But Alexander spared him, let him live. In fact, he briefly made him, gave him a position in Thrace, and then recalled him when he was ready to march to Asia, and put him in charge of the Thessalian cavalry. That was a plum assignment. Okay, it's not as much as Philotas being in charge of the Macedonian companions, but it's not small change. And again, it suggests to us that Alexander L is an important guy. Okay, he's older than Alexander as well. ATG, so he's older than Alexander the Great. I'm not sure we know how much, but he is older. Probably more in line with the ages of Philotas and Craterus and such. So, all right, so he's over there. He's got command of this important unit, and about 2.5 years in. So Alexander crossed over in 334 from in the spring ish, moved from Greece to Asia. It took him that long to consolidate. So Philip is killed in 336. Alexander gets into Asia in 334, and he almost immediately winds up fighting the Battle of Granicus. That was, I'm not going to go into the battle, but except to say that at least if Diodorus can be believed, Parmenion was the architect of the strategy there. And we have two competing and mutually contradictory accounts of the battle. Arrian has one, which is, if I remember right, is followed by, well, we don't have Curtius's account, I don't think. Yeah, Curtius takes up just before Issus. Plutarch doesn't really talk about it. So you've got basically Arrian's account, and then you've got Diodorus' account, and they don't match. Now, while in a lot of cases, I'm probably going to go with Arrian over Diodorus, I'm thinking maybe it's been doctored, okay, Arrian's account, and that Diodorus might have the right of it. But if so, he follows the strategy suggested by Parmenion, okay. But it's a big victory. Alexander wins the respect of the men for his fighting ability in the battle. That's where he almost lost his life, and Clytus saves him at the last minute and cuts off the arm of the Persian who whacked his and damaged his helmet and such. So it was a big victory, and Alexander duly celebrated it and sent stuff home to Delphi and to the Parthenon and other things. And that, by the way, is about the last time that he did really pan-Hellenic stuff. After that, he starts doing more localized celebrations and such. But the polycentral is a term that's been used for it, and I like that term. But it's clear that he is announcing to the Greeks, see, I won this big battle. And it also tells the Persians, you might have a problem. You're going to have to consolidate. Darius didn't even bother showing up. He left it to Memnon and the Persians, and then they quarreled over what to do. If they had actually left Memnon in charge, things might not have gone so well for Alexander, but they were arrogant, and they believed Alexander wasn't worth dealing with, and so, they lost. It was more the Persians lost that battle, really, than Alexander won that battle. Although Issus was pretty brilliant. But be that as it may, Alexander comes out on top. The Persians realize we have to take this guy seriously. And then we get this very interesting story. Alexander goes down the coast. And whenever he is way down in the southern area, past Caria, and swinging inland, taking him on the road that will eventually take him to the Battle of Issus, he gets a letter from Parmenio, and this is at a place called Pharsalus. It's a little town, like I said, down there in the southwest corner of what is today Turkey. And Parmenion had got captured a Persian, okay, who had a letter from Darius written to Alexander L, offering him, I forget how many talents, a lot, to kill Alexander. And then Darius would support Alexander L's bid for the throne. Okay, there's no Amyntas anymore. Nobody's even talking about Argead. No Alexander of Lynkestis is alive. Okay, and there's a whole lot of cloak and dagger to this. It's actually really quite interesting. And I bring this up because I'm looking at it also in connection with Craterus, who will play into the Philotas affair later. Craterus's brother, Amphiterus, is sent by Alexander to Parmenion with this special letter that Alexander didn't even commit to writing. Amphiterus brought it from memory. Okay, and then Parmenion sends his stuff back. And this is in the winter of 334-3. Somewhere in there. And Sisinnes is the Persian's name. Let me make sure I got it right. Sisinnes. And he explains that, Darius was trying to buy off Alexander L. He doesn't say that Alexander L actually agreed to it, but the implication is enough. And remember that Amyntas, son of Antiochus, that fled earlier, bringing a letter, supposedly, from Alexander L to Darius? Nothing in that letter is mentioned that it was treasonous, but the implication is maybe it was. And now we've got a reply from Darius. Alexander's shown his medal at Granicus. Darius is actually worried. And so he figures, well, let's just get rid of the kid from the inside. So that's one date. And supposedly Alexander at that point took away, they had to be moved very carefully, hence all of this cloak and dagger with Craterus's brother. Probably younger brother, maybe. I don't, it doesn't say. And they do eventually arrest Alexander L. And they take away his command. But there's a competing date story that's later, that's in the fall of 333, just before Issus, in fact, where Alexander supposedly got a letter from Olympias implicating Alexander L. Okay, with something vague. And there's one other possibility is that maybe Alexander simply demoted him the first time. It didn't arrest him until he gets a letter later from Mommy Dearest. So we don't really know. Okay, we've got these two different stories. Maybe they're two different events. Maybe they're two pieces of the fall of Alexander L, if you will. But the interesting piece of all of this is that it's clearly going back to the accession of Alexander. So this is, Succession Wars Part 2, and that he ends up being arrested, but he's not killed. Okay, he is not killed. In fact, Alexander drags him around, depending on which of these two dates is correct, the winter of 334-3 or the fall of 333, which is almost like 9 months later, or at least 7 or 8, that he then gets dragged around with the army for 3.5 years, okay, in prison, whatever the moving prison is for this. And how much of that is Alexander's fear of upsetting Antipatros, but if he was really plotting against Alexander, would Antipatros necessarily support him? Or is Alexander maybe more, to my mind, plausibly worried about the influence of Alexander L, and particularly the Lynkestian troops and others that he wants to keep sweet, so I'm not going to kill him. I'll just keep him, under arrest. So things go on until the whole Philotas affair, when Alexander L is trotted back out and is apparently he's been in prison so long he can't even hardly talk or form a sentence the way it's described, and then he's implicated in all of that, and they kill him there. But that is the subject of a different video, so that will be our second conspiracy. But that covers the first one. And again, it is a holdover from the murder of Philip, and then the accession of Alexander the Great. But it tells us a fair bit about power at the court and the still resolving power between Upper Macedonia perhaps wanting some independence, and Lower Macedonia trying to bring them to heel, if you will, there. So that's where I'll end for now, and we'll take up with the Philotas affair next.